All right.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this statewide conference call about Texas marijuana policy. My name is Heather. I'm the director of Texans for Responsible Marijuana Policy. And today we're going to talk through some of the proposed legislation, talk about our priorities moving into the legislative session, how we can have the best bills possible and get something across the finish line, overcoming the challenges that we're going to face, not only political challenges, but also COVID restrictions. And I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Jax Finkel, and I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself, Jax.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jax Finkel. I'm the executive director for Texas NORML. Texas NORML is part of the coalition, Texans for Responsible Marijuana Policy, and we've been working together for Heather and I have known each other for a really long time, but we've been working really closely together for the last several years, making sure that we are a good conduit between legislators and activists during the session to make sure that we are trying to know the most current things and share them with you. And that's really the point of today, is to go over what to expect. I recognize a lot of you have been up at the Capitol, and it's going to be very different this year, you guys. So the relationships that you guys have built over the years with all of the work that you've done, as well as virtual engagement this year, is going to be number one. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us. And I know that Heather is going to kick us off by starting us in the right direction. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Heather.
Awesome, thank you. And I noticed one of the questions was about the chat feature, and it looks like we don't have that enabled for this webinar, but you can utilize the Q&A section here. And as Jax mentioned, we're going to try to maybe answer some as we go, but we'll definitely take questions at the end as well once we've kind of gone through everything. So wow. Well, we have a lot of work to do. Let's start there. Let's being very clear that, we are still in a conservative state. We still see so many folks, clinging to prohibition. And we have seen so much progress in recent years, thanks to the advocates across the state who have been getting active, getting engaged, communicating with lawmakers and helping them to understand how these policies affect real lives, lives of individuals, lives of families, and our communities as a whole. So we want to make sure that we continue to do that. Jax is going to talk later about COVID restrictions and how that impacts our work. And we'll talk about digital engagement. But first I want to talk about, and so that's about process. And so, but first let's talk about policy. Our current policies in Texas are harsh and unreasonable, frankly. Even for a small amount of marijuana, someone can be facing 6 months in jail and a lifetime permanent criminal record that carries collateral consequences like hindered access to education, employment, housing, driver's license suspension. We also have a compassionate use program that's unreasonably restrictive, only allowing a small number of patients access to the program. And even once they're participating, they only have access to low THC cannabis, capped at 0.5%. We know that patients benefit from THC as a therapeutic component of the plant, and it's our position that doctors should be the ones making these decisions. So let's talk about some of our priorities moving forward. When we talk about decriminalization and reduced penalties, we've already seen several pieces of legislation introduced. And no matter what gets introduced and starts moving through the process, we have several priority provisions that we'd like to see included. Ideally, this wouldn't be a crime at all. You wouldn't be facing any penalties for possessing a plant that's objectively safer than alcohol and tobacco. But we know that we have to start somewhere, and we have to stop the bleeding when it comes to the tens of thousands of people who are arrested annually in the state of Texas. And they're arrested mostly for possession, not trafficking or distribution, but the simple possession of this plant. So we'd like to see penalties reduced, making sure that no one goes to jail for marijuana possession, at least for small amounts, talking about an ounce or two. There are varying proposals depending on which one we're looking at for the amount there. I think it makes sense for 2 ounces. That's the lowest category in the schedule currently. But we also have seen common ground found on 1 ounce, which is what most people are arrested for. So we'd like to see no arrests made whatsoever, no jail time associated with the penalties. And really, most importantly, though, we'd like to see people being able to avoid a conviction. We know that these lasting collateral consequences can significantly derail lives and keep people from being able to participate fully in their communities and provide for their families when they're not able to get jobs that they're otherwise qualified for, or continue their education because of a criminal record. So we'd like to see an opportunity for folks to avoid that criminal record. Last legislative session, we saw common ground on a bill that was carried by Representative Moody. It eliminated the threat of arrest, jail time, and did offer that opportunity through a deferral and dismissal opportunity, similar to a speeding ticket where you can take a defensive driving class and get a case dismissed. This would allow you to work with the judge or the prosecutor and take a drug education course or do community service and get that case dismissed. Obviously, this isn't ideal. We don't think that people using cannabis should be subject to even that. But we do also need to recognize where we are in Texas and work from where we are. So we saw common ground on that with Democrats and Republicans in the House, as well as the governor getting on board with that provision. So those are the top priorities. We'd also like to see folks no longer being subjected to a driver's license suspension. Whether you're in, near, or around a car at the time of being caught with marijuana, you can have your driver's license suspended, or you will have it suspended upon conviction. So we'd like to see that changed as well. We're also seeing more conversation about expungements. This is so important. These laws were unjust to begin with, and people who have been saddled with criminal records or even with an arrest record, not found guilty at all, had the case dismissed or were found innocent, they are still saddled with an arrest record. And we should be working with the state to help clear these records so folks can move on with their lives. We have seen recently more support coming on board with a proposal to reduce penalties. Even the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a very conservative think tank, is on board now with moving it to a Class C misdemeanor and supporting the types of provisions that we'd like to see. Of course, this is in addition to our broad coalition that it brings together Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, Independents, all coming together on an area upon which we agree. We also see great consensus on medical cannabis and allowing patients safe and legal access to it. So we'd like to see the compassionate use program made more inclusive. Currently, there are only a few qualifying conditions. Even though it was expanded in 19, it still only allows a small number of Texans to actually access it. So we'd like to see the list of qualifying conditions expanded. Ideally, doctors would be making the decision altogether. They are trusted with far more dangerous substances than cannabis, and they have discretion even to prescribe drugs off-label. They should be able to decide if an individual can benefit from cannabis, if the risk and the benefit outweighs the risk. So in that way, we'd like doctors to be trusted with practicing medicine, but we do understand the concerns that some people have. And in most states, there's a list of qualifying conditions, and Texas should at least be on par with what is now 36 states throughout the United States that no longer deprive patients access to medicine. And that includes every state around Texas. I mean, we are behind Oklahoma and Arkansas. Something has to change. And so we're working to make it more inclusive by adding more qualifying conditions. And another important component is dosing. Doctors and patients should work together to determine levels of THC that work for that individual. Biochemistry is different, medical conditions are different, and the way we respond to these chemicals are different. They should have that discretion. So we'd like to see the arbitrary cap on THC removed entirely from the compassionate use program, again, allowing doctors and patients to make those decisions. A couple other important things to change with the compassionate use program to make it better. One would be allowing independent labs to test these products. I have faith in the companies that are operating under the current program. I think that they're doing a great job using state-of-the-art technology and really providing quality medicine. But from a public policy perspective and a big picture perspective, once we start making this program more robust, getting more patients involved, getting more businesses licensed, there needs to be that level of accountability that can only come from independent labs testing products, providing consumer reports, to make sure that what's on the label is in fact what's in the bottle with regard to potency, contamination, making sure it's free from molds or pesticides. Again, we need to make sure that independent labs can test these products. And we can do that easily by allowing labs that are already certified in the state to register with the program, which would allow them to possess this product so that they can test it. A couple other changes more on the business side of things. Right now, the licensing fees are outrageous to participate in the compassionate use program. We're talking about nearly $500,000 for the first 2 years of licensure, and almost or more than $300,000 every 2 years after that. Plus, of course, you have to register each employee as they come and go, and renewals. It really is outrageous, and especially for one of the most limited programs in the country. Additionally, we think that dispensaries should be able to open up locations around the state so that they don't have to individually drive orders to the individuals, or the individuals have to come to them. They should be able to set up shop around the state, much like we have in other states where dispensaries are able to open multiple locations. So moving on to adult use, which is something that we know is supported by a majority of Americans, is supported by a majority of Texans, and increasingly we're seeing conversation about it finally, talking about this issue, not only from the perspective of it's the right thing to do. It has always been wrong to arrest and prosecute people for the possession of this plant. Prohibition has been an abject failure by every measure. And we need to make sure that we are getting off of that track of criminalization and bringing this market into the light of day. It's the right thing to do from a moral and an ethical perspective, but it also economically is a great way to go. Our state is facing unprecedented budget shortfall because of the fallout from the coronavirus, and the comptroller estimates $4 billion as a shortfall. To help fill that gap, we could bring the market for responsible adult use of marijuana into the light of day, license businesses where there's more accountability, where taxes are being paid, reasonable levels of taxes are being paid, and we can help to fill that shortfall. It's estimated that we could bring in $1.1 billion per budget cycle if we were to simply legalize this product, for which we know there's a demand and we know there's a supply coming in. Always has, always will. So thankfully, people are at the table having the conversation about this. You know, lawmakers, even the most conservative among them, are looking at this as something that they have to talk about and have an honest and serious conversation. Of course, we have a lot of work to do to overcome some of the challenges, the misinformation that some folks have, and make sure that we are validating reasonable concerns and helping them to understand that in states that have legalized, the sky hasn't fallen. Teenagers aren't using it more often. In fact, they've been able to stamp out the black market by 70% in Colorado, for example. But where they haven't been able to stamp out the black market, and we hear this a lot from opponents, is the black market is still thriving. Well, it certainly still exists. It probably will always exist to some degree. But the bottom line is that it exists, and in large part because of states like Texas that are clinging to prohibition and providing a demand for that illegal supply. Most Texans would prefer to buy from a licensed business in Texas where they know the product is safe, that it's been tested, and that there's accountability for any wrongdoing. So thankfully, things are on the right track with that. Some of our priorities with policies, with that type of policy, are reasonable tax rates. We know that high taxes lead to a thriving black market because it's more expensive to purchase it legally. States like California have done things seemingly all wrong, and they have led to really that thriving black market that folks talk about. So we want to make sure we keep taxes and regulations reasonable so that we don't incentivize that. Expunging arrest records and sealing convictions is something that's incredibly important. Of course, we want to make sure that there's a level of restorative justice involved here. That is incredibly important too. We've seen several proposals put forward already, nearly 24 bills, and we'll provide a link. Actually, Jax, do you mind going ahead and dropping a link to the list of bills if anybody wants to check them out? I want to just highlight a few of our kind of top bills. They are not all created equally. They all have different provisions, but I want to let you know a few of our priorities. Well, you know what the priorities are, right? Decriminalization, expanding medical access, and working on legalizing for adult use as well. But the top decrim bills, I would say that there are 4. The first 2 are about flower. We have Representatives Weiner's House Bill 441 and Representative Toth's 99. House Bill 99, that is. Both of them reduce penalties for low-level possession. Representative Weiner's bill goes a little bit further, adding expungements to that. It also has the provisions for allowing people to avoid a criminal record. It makes sure that there's no arrest as well. Representative Toth's House Bill 99 is a good one. I think that we're missing one provision that he's already expressed support for. It includes no arrest, it includes no driver's license suspension. There's no jail time associated because it's a Class C misdemeanor. However, it's missing the component that allows people to avoid the conviction. I'll actually be talking with him on Monday to make sure that we have language together so that he can introduce that provision and round this bill out so it's a very good one that we can all support. There's another layer of decriminalization that I hadn't mentioned yet, but of course is important, and that's relating to concentrates. Any amount of concentrated product, whether it's a little bit of oil in a vape pen or a muffin that is infused with cannabis, they're automatic felonies. And what's worse is that you're going to be charged for the entire weight of the product, not just the cannabis that's in the product. So there are two pieces of legislation to help fix this. We have House Bill 439 by Representative Terry Canales and Senate Bill 151 by Senator Nathan Johnson. Both of these bills bring the penalty down into misdemeanor range, and they require that law enforcement test the product and only charge the person for the amount of cannabis inside of that product. It's more like a truth and assessment type of provision. And I'm so grateful to have those two introducing that legislation and it really getting much more traction this time around because of how unreasonable it is for someone to be charged with a felony for using a vape pen, which we know vaping is safer than smoking objectively. So they should be wanting to encourage that rather than severely discouraging it. As far as top medical marijuana bills, we have Senate Bill 90 by Senator Jose Menendez from San Antonio, and we have House Bill 43 by Representative Alex Dominguez. Both of these bills expand the compassionate use program, making them more inclusive. There are two other bills that I want to mention briefly. We have House Bill 567 by Representative James Frank and Senate Bill 190 by Senator Brian Hughes. Both of these relate to parental protections. Now, these bills do not expand the compassionate use program. They're specifically about protecting families so that if a parent or a child is using the compassionate use program legally under state law, that parental rights cannot be jeopardized. So incredibly important. It is worth noting that those provisions are included in Senator Menendez and Representative Dominguez bills as well. And then the top legalization bill to look out for is Representative Moody's House Bill 447. He has already been doing a tremendous job of laying out the good reasons for moving forward with a legal market rather than maintaining prohibition. There are two other proposals as well that we can keep an eye on. Senator Roland Gutierrez has introduced a bill that could use some improvement, and I know that he's been open to amendments to making this bill a little bit better as it makes its way through the Senate, and we're grateful for his leadership. And then Senator Eckhart introducing a constitutional amendment, which Jax is going to get into next, what is a constitutional amendment, a resolution versus a bill, and what are the pros and the cons? So she's introduced a bill that would be a constitutional amendment, but all relating to legalization. I do want to note before I kick it back over to Jax that messaging is important. The language that we use is important, and the approach that we take is important. Being kind to others, even if they disagree, providing valuable information to help them see things a little bit differently. And one thing to note when we talk about legalization is, the term recreational marijuana tends to be something that's demonized and is something that we can kind of pivot our language and talk about responsible adult use for those who are 21 and up. It helps to alleviate some of the concern about, driving under the influence or while impaired is not acceptable. You should be responsible. Keeping it out of the hands of kids is, of course, something, unless we're talking about medical purposes, of course, is something that we all share that objective. And so talking about responsible adult use helps to really round out that conversation. Jax is going to talk about constitutional amendments and COVID restrictions, how this affects our ability to advocate at the Capitol. So without further ado, go ahead, Jax.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather. So the one downfall to having Q&A on here and not chat is that I can't drop the link in there. So what I'm going to do real quick, before I start talking about the joint resolutions is just share my screen to the page where you can find everything. If you go to texasnormal.org/87-tx-ledge, this is where you're going to see all of the actions that we have: medical, penalty, and legalization. Those are actions you can participate in. There's a link here to submit your testimony so that you can be included in hearing binders. And then we've got all these bills. And our colleague Stephen Carter has been keeping this site updated. Look at all that stuff. I'm just scrolling by. I did get an alert last night that there is a new bill. We will need to add that to this page. But what I would like to talk about is these joint resolutions real quickly. So what is a joint resolution and how is that different than your typical bill? So a joint resolution is something that actually is going to be amending the Constitution for Texas. And so it has a different bar for passing. It has to pass out of the House and out of the Senate with a supermajority. It then bypasses the governor and goes to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State will then put it up for the next election, or whichever election is statutorily written into the joint resolution. And during that time, of course, there will be a lot of campaigning, both for and against, because this is Texas, let's be real. There is going to be people going against it. And then at that point, everybody can vote on it. And if it passes, it will be kicked back to the legislature, who will create the statutes around the joint resolution. And then it would go through the regulatory process. And then at that point, we would either have a retail or a medical market based off of this joint resolution. So it is a fairly lengthy process. It also can be expensive due to the dramatic need for advertising. You better believe that law enforcement is going to come out and be talking about this, people like Sam. So joint resolutions do have that higher barrier and a longer time to pass, but nonetheless, we have 3 joint resolutions in the House. Two for medical cannabis and 1 for legalization. And then of course, Senator Eckhart is going to have the one on legalization as well. But you'll note whenever you look at the text, if you go to that page, that it's only about a page long, because it's really just what would the verbiage be that is on your ballot, and that's basically what that is. So joint resolutions are definitely worthy for certain things. For this session, I don't know that those would be necessarily the best bets, especially for medical. I think we have some really good priorities and chances to change medical. But nevertheless, I think that it is an important thing to know that is going on, to track that it's happening, and definitely offering testimony and feedback as it moves through the process. So what I would like to talk about next is, I think, something that everybody has been, I don't know if nervous or excited or nerve-sided is the right word, but COVID restrictions at the Capitol. What is it going to look like this legislative session? And I want to preface what I'm about to say by letting everyone know that no official protocols have been released or approved. That will happen on January the 12th, which is the first day of legislative session. We will be hosting a workshop that evening, and assuming that all the protocols pass that day, we will be giving you a live update about those. Otherwise, as soon as we have them, we're going to make sure you guys have them, because it's going to be the guideline and the playbook to how we have to engage this session. But some of the generic things that we've seen laid out between both of the chambers is that, you know, when the legislators are on the dais, there will be plexiglass dividers in place. You may have seen there's been an interim charge or 2 that have had in-person committee hearings, and they did have those in place. They're not allowing staff to be on the dais with the legislators. They're limiting the number of witnesses that are allowed in the room at any one time. And we also found out that they're not allowing the auditorium to be reserved at this time, because they need to be able to have overflow for witnesses. This may also turn into meeting rooms are not going to be able to be reserved. So we'll see how that will affect interaction there. There is likely to be a mask mandate, although I'm sure you guys know that there are some people who do not want to have to wear a mask and some that want people to have to wear masks. So it is potentially going to be a little bit contentious. I'll get into the numbers on that a little bit later. The committees will likely meet every other week. Typically in the session, they will meet every week, sometimes multiple times a week if there's a lot of business to be done. And because they're going to be meeting every other week, there's also going to be this limit on the number of bills that are going to be assigned to committees. Now, we're not being told that it's going to be a specific number limit, but there's not going to be as many like courtesy bills that are moved to committee. It's really going to be the priority bills that they've already kind of decided they want to see moving forward. So all of these things have kind of been put into place, but at the Capitol, they still need to do a few HVAC updates. They do have air purification filters in the system in the chambers, but they still need to implement them in the committee rooms and the conference rooms and all of the offices. So that's a lot of infrastructure change inside of the Capitol. There will also be limited access to the chambers, both chambers. In fact, it is likely that media will not be allowed on the floor of the House or the Senate, and that they will be in the gallery. And it's unknown if the public will be allowed in the gallery or not. Sometimes legislators are allowed to have guests on the floor, and that will be severely limited, if not just not allowed. So to let you know, in the House, I think a lot of the people on here are political junkies, but if you're not, let me catch you up a little bit on the speaker. So Speaker Bonin from last session did not run for re-election and is not going to be speaker next session. Chairman Dade Phelan has kind of risen to the top as the person who has the most support and is likely to be the Speaker of the House. And he has already started to make some moves and some arrangements to proactively work on getting protocols set in place so that they're not waiting until after the chairman is decided. So he put a committee together, and there's some names you might recognize on there. Donna Howard from Austin, she's a nurse. Stephanie Click from the Fort Worth area, she's a nurse. Joe Moody, who we all know as well, are all on the committee. And the committee is chaired by Charlie Jaron. And I want to give you a few things that he said in an interview the other day that I thought was interesting. He touched on a survey that they sent out, I want to say it was a few months ago, to the members, and 135 members responded. 80% wanted masks to be worn. At the time that they sent the survey out, they didn't have a rapid test available, so that wasn't an option to ask them about. So we don't have information on that. But when they were asked about virtual testimony, it was about 50-50 for the representatives supporting virtual testimony. You know, I would like to see more support of it, of course, but I do understand that there are some problems to virtual testimony, you know, connection, actually people even having access to Wi-Fi or a device. And then on top of that, how do you know when you cut off witnesses? You know, could you have, you know, thousands of people signed up to give testimony, and how would that work? So I think if they can work that out, that would be really great, because we would love to have some virtual testimony. Most members agree that there won't be chamber days or, you know, specialty days where a county comes in and visits the Capitol. And they have already purchased software to allow for remote voting. So there will be hardwired computers likely, or some kind of pad or device that is geofenced to their office area, but they're still figuring out how exactly that will work. Now on the Senate, we got some more detailed information from them. Again, not final, but this is what they've put out. On the 12th of January, which is the first day, each member will be allowed to have only one person on the floor and one person in the gallery. All of them have to be tested for coronavirus. And there will be no transferring of any passes between anybody. There will be a short ceremony. And then on the 13th, everybody is going to have to be tested again. Starting on January 18th, the Senate will take a week off, and then the Senate Finance Committee will come back on January 25th. For the rest of January and February, the Senate will meet on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And then in February, other committees will start to meet as well. The committees will be announced when the rules are adopted, so that should be the Friday after the first day of session if everything goes as planned. And no one will be on the floors for resolutions. So the resolutions are usually where they honor people, you know, like maybe Matthew McConaughey comes and shakes some hands. That won't be happening, that type of thing. Now this was something I really want everybody to listen up to this point, because I bolded it in my notes. So that means it's important. Those who testify in person will be required to sign up online 3 days in advance. They will need to test 24 hours in advance. They will then receive a QR code that they will have to show at the entrance of the Texas Capitol. Testing can be done at the Capitol by the National Guard, which can test about 12 people per hour. The results take up to an hour to receive, and then the people can come inside. So that's a lot. Just make sure that you keep that in your mind whenever you're thinking about the session. Again, in the Senate, media would just be in the gallery. And in fact, they're talking about maybe only allowing one pool reporter to be present on the floor. Staffers would still sit up near the dais on the floor, and those people would be tested regularly. This is also in bold print, so listen up. There will be no big lobby days. Know how we like to get our 400 people up on the Capitol on a Tuesday and talk about cannabis? Nope, that will not be able to happen in that form this session. So to that end, we are coming up with some creative ideas to work on and implement. So senators, again, they also expect for there to be fewer bills, and staff will have to sit in the audience during committee hearings. This is something that I think everybody should listen up to. Redistricting committees. So this session, in addition to TDA sunsetting, which sunsetting is when an agency every 12 years gets evaluated. Are they going to renew it, dissolve it, or change it? What's the deal? And it's TDA, the Texas Department of Agriculture this year. We've also got the budgetary shortfall. And in the House, we've got the Speaker of the House. Well, on top of that, we have redistricting, where they decide the new lines for the districts here in Texas. And that can be pretty contentious. But the redistricting committee will be in the Senate, the only committee allowed to take virtual testimony. However, both sides of the chamber recognize that Washington may not even have census data to the states until mid-July. So there's kind of this consensus that it's likely that there will have to be a special session to deal with redistricting. So that's a lot, and I'm sure there are questions, and we will definitely get to them. But I also wanted to touch on how COVID restrictions are going to affect our work. So there's no big lobby days, as I mentioned. So what we're going to be working on is trying to do organized in-district lobby days where we can set up a Zoom call with staffers or legislators and create that space there. Many of you that are on this call participated in our direct actions last session, where at first it was every other week and then it was every week. We went to all 181 offices in the Capitol and dropped off some new tidbit, some new fascinating point about cannabis, right? Well, we're not going to be able to hand things off. We're probably not even going to be able to be in the building. So we're going to be doing that virtually. We're going to be using a system so we can see who's opening things, who's clicking things, making sure we're following up on key offices that we need to make sure see that. And to that end, I want to make sure that I reiterate that on that page that I mentioned, texasnormal.org 87-TX-ledge, there is a tab to submit your testimony. And this is going to be really important. We have several volunteers who I think actually are all on this call. So hello, and thank you for joining. Who are taking these submissions. They're turning them into some one-pagers, and we are going to be using them not only for committee hearing binders to make sure that the committee members can hear from you guys, but also we will be using them in any manner that it might be helpful in these direct actions. Is there a legislator that maybe just doesn't believe that PTSD needs high THC cannabis, and we have an excellent, testimonial about that? Then we're going to share that with them. We're also working on the educational exhibits. You guys probably remember we did one for medical penalty reduction and for veterans issues last session. Well, we have made reservations again this session. However, they will be unmanned. So these will be exhibits that we are setting up. And in all likelihood, it may literally be only legislators walking by them, which is fine. That's who needs to see them. But that itself may be canceled. As of right now, they have accepted our applications. We have our spots reserved. But again, we're going to have to stay really flexible for this session and just move with what happens with the pandemic. Also, we're going to be doing virtual legislative briefings. This last election cycle, Heather and I did our first ever candidate briefing virtually, and it had really, really great response, and hundreds of candidates watched it. Several incumbents were mentioning how they watched it and enjoyed it on different things that they were on. So we want to provide the same thing for legislators in a timely manner at the Capitol. So we want to have one on penalty reduction, one on medical cannabis, and then one about the retail market. Now, on that same page with all of the bills and action alerts, you'll see when you click on those action alerts, we have a form letter there. Now, the form letter is editable, so feel free to kind of make it your own and make it personal. And in fact, we encourage that because what we're hearing from legislators that only constituent direct contact is what is really mattering even more than ever this session. And so we don't want it to look like a whole bunch of the same letters hitting them. So we are going to have a whole bunch of variants. Again, some volunteers on the call are working to help those. So you can also just click and move through, but we also really encourage you to customize and tweak it to make it personal and pertinent to you. And we're also working on call scripts. It's going to be important that you are in contact with your legislator, or more likely the staffer that is in charge of this topic. And so having call scripts to help you prepare for that. Now, I have only mentioned, 19 different things here that we're going to try to do, and I'm sure there's going to be more as we try to become more creative over time. But I just wanted to give you guys a basic idea of what we can expect this session. It's going to be unlike any other. So on top of dealing with some pretty intense issues, there's going to be this technological divide, if you will, if that might be the right word. So I want to go ahead and bring Heather back up here so that she can chat with you guys about some of the things we have planned. All right, welcome back, Heather. Take it away.
All right, thank you. And Jack's talked a lot about what we are going to be doing and how to take action now. So I want to reiterate some of that and maybe offer some other opportunities as well. So like she mentioned, instead of doing big lobby days, we're going to be helping to coordinate group meetings with legislators or their staff from folks in their district. You also are free to contact your legislators, contact their staff, and see if maybe you can schedule that private meeting. This is especially important if you have a personal or professional story to tell. If you or a loved one need access to medical cannabis, or are living with a criminal record that keeps you from getting the job you're qualified for. Also, if you're a medical professional or you are a former law enforcement or an attorney who has a particular insight into how these policies are affecting real lives, those types of experiences are really helping to get lawmakers on board and helping them to see this a bit more clearly. It's difficult for anyone who sits down to have a conversation about these policies to walk away supporting the status quo. And that's where we come in as advocates, is helping them to understand how these policies are affecting the lives of Texans across the state, including those in their districts. So video meetings are a great way to connect with these folks while we're unable to meet in person. One thing that Jack's mentioned that I want to reiterate is the tremendous value of having really only constituents contacting their legislators. If a legislative office is getting bombarded with calls from around the state, they're more likely to shut down and not shut down operations and pack up and go home, but shut down as far as hearing us. And so when they hear from their constituents, it's so powerful, and we want to make sure that we're encouraging that. So if you have already contacted your legislator and you're feeling like you're sitting on your hands and you want to do something else, feel free to call back the next week and touch base with them, send them an article to a report that was just issued or a news story that you think is relevant. But also consider yourself a force multiplier. Find 5 people in your district to call throughout the week. You have the power to help educate those who want to see these laws changed and help to activate them. Give them the phone number to call and tell them, it can be something simple when you call or when you send an email. But we each can have that opportunity to be those multipliers and get folks from around the state activated, demonstrating really that this is a grassroots movement. Our power is in the power of the people. So let's make sure that everyone is adequately prepared to contact legislators and make this a priority. I want to encourage folks to focus on their senators as a priority. We definitely want to be contacting our representatives 100%. But we did pass out of the House with a great comprehensive medical bill, a penalty reduction bill already. And so we've got support in the House, which we want to firm up. So again, do contact your representatives, but consider making your senator the priority, because these pieces of legislation haven't made it to the Senate yet. And what one of the challenges we face is leadership in the Senate, really keeping progress and being a gatekeeper there. But one of the ways that we can impact the leadership's position on the issue is by having senators contacting him and saying, hey, I want to hear this bill. We need to have a hearing on a full medical cannabis bill. We need to consider decriminalization. And so contacting your senators, getting them on board helps to build, again, that grassroots momentum that we need. A couple other things Jax mentioned was collecting testimonials. Make sure you make it personal. Talk about your own personal experience, your family's experience. We have that form. We'll be able to share it. Somehow we'll be able to share it. We'll get it to you, a link to collecting testimonials. So it's a form that you fill out with your information, your personal background, why this is important to you, and what you want legislators to do. And our great volunteers are helping to kind of put that together for you, polish it up, and allow you to take that testimonial to submit to your legislators, to have it ready for when the committees have hearings, that you can submit it there. You don't want to be scrambling at the last minute. So the more we can do now, the better prepared we're going to be when the time comes. And this kind of leads to another opportunity is your personal testimony can be turned into a letter to the editor or an op-ed that can be submitted to news publications. This is something that anyone can do. Now, they don't accept everything that gets submitted, but if it's well written and if it's personal and timely, you may be able to get something published in your local newspaper. These types of opportunities really add to our momentum and give us really free coverage to the news publications audience. So the hundreds or thousands of people that they have in their distribution list would be receiving your message. So consider turning that testimonial into an op-ed or letter to the editor. One final thing that I want to note before we open it up for questions and start collaborating on that is digital engagement on social media. I can't stress enough how important it is to be kind and to be thorough. Snarky comments on social media feel gratifying sometimes, but they don't bring people onto the right side of the cause. We have access to information like never before in human history. We have access to links from research that's been done around the world, news articles that have been published, and there have been plenty of them, even just here in Texas within the last month. These types of resources can help not only the person that you're engaging with directly, but everyone else in their social media circle that's paying attention to that. So consider yourself an ambassador for the movement with every comment you're making on a news story when they post it, and we have a thread of thousands of comments. Add action alerts there. If you know that folks that are supportive and they're saying, yeah, we should legalize it, drop them a link so they can send an email to their legislator. Help to recruit these folks that are eager to see these laws changed, and make sure that we're being kind to those who may be opposed to where we're at or sitting on the fence. There's a lot of people that are sitting on the fence and are looking to hear the good arguments so they can fall on the right side of history, which is, of course, to repeal marijuana prohibition and get these laws reformed so we're not doing the monumental harm that we have been doing in our state for far too long. So with that, I want to ask Jax to come back and we will go through some of these questions that we've got in the Q&A.
I wanted to also say that since everybody registered, we're going to be doing a follow-up email afterwards. So I'll make sure that I have all the links in there. And since we're recording this, we're also going to make it available on YouTube. So if you have any friends who are like, hey, what should I expect out of the session? What are these COVID protocols shaping up to look like? We'll have that all available to you, probably either sometime tomorrow or Monday, depending on how quickly we get it done. But yes, I noticed a few things in the comments, Heather, and I guess the first one I'd like to touch on is home grow. People were asking about home grow. I know that Representative Moody's legalization bill includes it, and Senator Menendez's bill does include it as well. Fairly reasonable regulations over that. But did you want to talk maybe to a little bit broader conversation of how homegrown is really viewed at the Capitol?
Sure. Well, it's definitely something that's worth talking about and fighting for, especially when it comes to patients, because it does require a lot of plant material in order to make the oils, for example, that many of them are using. And, it can get expensive. And really, you should have the right to be able to do that. We're talking about a plant, an herb that is helpful to people. So it's definitely worth having a conversation about. And we have to do it in an effective way because, as Jack's alluded, there are apprehensions about that. Lawmakers wanting to see this program being very tightly regulated so that cannabis isn't being diverted to the black market, which is a reasonable concern. And so a lot of the concern is that how are we going to regulate the growth of these plants in individuals' homes? And we can help to overcome that by pointing out, of course, that we're talking about secure locked locations. We're talking about a limited number of plants. We're talking about, in Moody's bill, it's 12 plants. So we're not talking about a huge field that's going unregulated. We're talking about a few plants for an individual. And I think that's an important angle for us to bring up. And also, doing so in an effective way. And of course, it's important to talk about your rights, but just saying that you should be able to do it because it's your right isn't going to pass muster with some of these folks. So we need to demonstrate why it's important. Why should patients have access to a good number of plants to be able to grow on their own? What about the costs and how that's associated with what people can use and where they buy it? So make sure that if you're going to be advocating for home grow, that you've got effective arguments lined up and that you're ready to go to bat for that. Of course, there are lots of other provisions within the legislation that we need to prioritize as well. But each of us can choose what we think is most important and really make sure that we're making those effective arguments.
And also what we think will speak to our personal legislator.
Mm-hmm.
If your legislator is a big ag person, maybe they can get really behind it and really support you, or they might have a different point of view if they support other topics, which goes to Carl's question, how do we find out what staffer to email for our rep? So in the email, I will make sure to include a link to our activist training, which kind of goes down the whole way that you want to reach out to the office, engage with the legislators and the staffers, how you would follow up. But the basic too long didn't read version is go to who represents me, look at who your Texas state representative and Texas state senators are. They deal with the state legislation, not federal. And you'll take those in-district office numbers, because right now they're still in district. They're not up at the Capitol until January. And you'll call those numbers and ask, hey, I'm looking to talk to whoever's in charge with penalty reduction or medical cannabis. And right now they're starting to assign those things. So they may say, hey, call back XYZ and we'll know by then. But in some cases, they already know who's dealing with that and they are already drafting bills and working on things. So that is the too long didn't read version of how to do that. Also, I saw someone talking about expunction, Heather, and getting rid of old charges. So I know expunction process is included in Zweiner's bill, but again, that's for flower. So that doesn't have to do with these like felony concentrate charges that we're talking about. Can you remind me, was expunction included in Canalis's bill? Because if not, perhaps that would be an opportunity where his constituents could reach out to him and ask him to include that.
I don't think it was included. His bill is pretty clean on just the penalty reduction and the truth in assessment. But Representative Canales and Senator Johnson care deeply about this issue. And so I would invite everyone that's in their district to definitely reach out. Number one, show them some love and some gratitude for them introducing. And I'd say that for everyone who lives in a district represented by someone who has introduced this legislation, start with a thank you and an introduction. And then you can talk about the provisions maybe that we would like to see added to it, including maybe expungement.
And then that goes to also answer Twyla's question about who does she need to contact. So it's that Texas state representative and Texas state senator. And in the email, we'll have that activist training guide. It's a little video that you can watch while you're doing something else, and have us in the background telling you how to legalize marijuana.
Yeah.
Also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, she also asked about meetings in Bryan and College Station. And with the climate now, with COVID restrictions and wanting to be safe, we haven't been hosting any in-person meetings. And I'm hoping that we get to a point in 2021 that we're able to do that. Things loosen up, people are feeling safer, we're able to do it in a safe way. But unfortunately, there aren't any upcoming meetings that we'll be hosting in person.
But we do have some events coming up in January, so I will also include links to those. One of them is going to be the legislative workshop that we'll be giving the evening of that first day of session. I also noticed that someone was talking about releasing prisoners. So I think in this situation, it would probably be people who were maybe indigent and were having to serve their time in jail, or perhaps were serving for felony charges. And, no current bills actually address releasing them. And I think that one of the issues that we see here in Texas, even the expunction process is pretty laborsome. And a lot of people are of the mind, well, you broke the law when it was the law. So we definitely have some work to do on that in talking about this. And I think that having things like the MORE Act moving at the federal level helps highlight this conversation. And so I'm hopeful that in conjunction with federal things that we can help continue that conversation.
Now I see a question from Hassani, I hope I pronounced your name right, about, what is the holdup? Who is financially funding the opposition? And, I don't think that our opposition is very well funded, except for the fact that in a good number of them are members of law enforcement who come down in uniform, hopefully not on the clock, but to come and really talk about and instill a sense of fear. That's what we see really driving the opposition, in my opinion, is fear and misinformation, misrepresentation of what we want to accomplish and what the effects have been in other states. And so we have an education campaign to help folks overcome these objections that, for example, they talk a lot about teen use. Like if in legal states, if we loosen it up, teens are going to think it's okay to use cannabis and they're going to use it more. But the reality is that in legal states, teenagers are not using cannabis anymore. In fact, it may have gone down a bit. And I would suggest that that has to do with the fact that the Black market is much smaller because there's a legal market, and kids can only get cannabis in the illegal market. When dispensaries are requiring ID, they're not selling to kids. So really helping to reframe those arguments and helping them to overcome those bits of misinformation that opponents just love to get in there, which is how prohibition has been perpetuated for the last century, are lies and misinformation from people working from our own government. So thankfully, we have the facts and the information on our side that we can present to lawmakers to help them make the right decision.
Yeah, and it's really those executive police and sheriff's associations that we are seeing opposing these types of legislation. So if you have any connections with them, I would encourage you to reach out and chat with them. I think that this is going to be one good side effect to having TPPF on board with some of these changes, is that hopefully they'll be able to really effectively communicate with law enforcement on that. I wanted to go back to something that someone mentioned at the beginning, and so I made a note that I wanted to come back to it, if you don't mind, Heather. But so a gentleman running for city council in the next year or so, and talking about, what can city council do? And we know that, the statute is made at the state level, but there is this, kind of discretionary zone that local areas can take activity in. And we've seen some of the people that are on this call even doing it up in DFW and San Antonio. But what happens is city council controls the purse strings. So, for example, in Austin, Texas, what we worked on was a resolution that would not allow any city funds to be spent on THC testing, prosecution, or imprisonment of anyone for cannabis. And so we were able to implement that. And since no dollars are being spent, they are telling cops not to arrest for it. There's other places where we see diversionary programs, first chance programs, cite and release programs. And so this is how at the local level, you can help build more pressure from the bottom up to the state level, because really it's a patchwork of policy across the state. What, might mean you'd pay a small fine and take a class in Houston could mean that you have a felony in the panhandle and really have a big problem. So that's some of the things that we can do on the local level, is engaging with our city council members about the budgetary options that they have, engaging with local DAs and county district attorneys as well, talking about prosecution and effectively spending those funds, and then talking with PDs and sheriffs about re-engaging with the communities and really prioritizing violent crimes with victims. In fact, we heard from someone from the Houston Forensics Science Center that, as we all know, crime labs are not super well funded. And since they're having to test these THC cannabis products, they're having to use funds on that as opposed to rape kit evidence, murder evidence. And so that is extremely problematic to me. So that was my diatribe on that, what you can do locally.
And Billy's got a question about Senate leadership. And this is on the minds of everyone, because that's where legislation stalled last time around, was with leadership in the Senate. And so is there any signal of more open-mindedness? And I have kind of two things to point to that are encouraging to me, but I don't want to I want to make sure that we really instill a sense of urgency and need to continue persuading our senators and the leadership in the Senate. So number one, last legislative session, the leadership in the Senate did not want to allow any cannabis related bills other than hemp through the legislature. And he may have even been apprehensive about that, but didn't want to let medical through and didn't want to let any decriminalization through. We certainly saw the public display on Twitter, as leadership in this country does now, saying that it wasn't going to go any, as far as decriminalization wasn't going to go anywhere in the Senate. And that was a really extraordinary move, because usually they will kill bills procedurally and quietly. And instead of doing that, this was a really big, loud statement that was made, which is not common. So a couple of things that have changed. Number one is some medical did end up getting through. So we were able, with people across the state, helping to advocate for medical cannabis. And it helped a lot that we had the two doctors in the Senate who happen to be Republicans really working hard on getting something through, because leadership didn't want to let anything. So even the minimal expansion of the compassionate use program took a ton of effort to even get through. So we can continue making these good arguments. Getting these personal stories in is really what helps to mobilize senators and helps leadership to better understand the issue and the real lives that are impacted. So that's one encouraging note. And the other side is that leadership has been talking a little bit more about criminal justice reform, and with organizations like TPPF and all of our Republican allies can help to put pressure on leadership to understand that this is a sensible, reducing penalties for low-level possession is a sensible approach. It's a modest change to current law, and it would have a really big impact on people's ability to live their lives freely and to be productive members of their community. So let's keep at it. And again, reiterating, contacting your senators so that they can make this a priority.
Very true. Patricia is asking, is Rep. Price still the chair of the Public Health Committee? So we go into more detail in the activist training that I'm going to send out about the whole legislative process. But the very short answer is committees will be assigned sometime in January, probably the end of January, first week of February in the House. And at that point, we will know who is in charge of which committees. Oftentimes we see people, return, but in a new speaker being in place, we might see some big switch ups. So the answer is, at this time, we do not know who will be the chair of public health for the 87th legislative session.
And another question about license holders. So in some states, there are caps on the number of licenses that can be issued. And it's been a little confusing in Texas because they have only issued 3 licenses. But it's important to note that there is no cap on licenses in Texas. And so that's something that I support. I think that if you have a good business plan, a viable company, if you meet all the requirements, you should be able to try your hand through free enterprise. That's something that should be in place effectively, though, because the governor and others want to keep this program very small, and they've worked very hard to do that. They have only issued 3 licenses, which was the statutory minimum number of licenses they had to issue. Now, many of y'all may remember the whole kerfluffle that happened about this time last year when the Department of Public Safety announced and moved forward with accepting new applications, and they were going to issue more licenses, and then decided to do a full 180, canceled the application period, and decided not to move forward. Now, there was some politics involved here. I wasn't directly involved, but I think that we can all understand kind of what happens in these situations. And it's unfortunate that that happened that way. DPS took a lot of heat from the public, who were very disappointed and about the lack of transparency and the fact that they, companies spend thousands of dollars to get an application ready. And they went 2 weeks into this application period and then canceled it. So they have the ability to do this, but there's political pressure to keep them from doing so. So I would recommend us keep staying the course on making sure that the governor, lieutenant governor, all of our elected officials understand this issue. It's not something to be scared of. The 3 licensed companies, really only 2 that are operational, have done a great job of demonstrating that this industry can be regulated well, that there are good actors. This is a professional industry, and it's not something that we need to be scared of or over regulate. We champion free enterprise in this state and individual liberty, personal responsibility. And it's my position that we should maintain those values and be consistent when we talk about the cannabis industry.
Well, and I think another thing is that, whenever you have such a very restricted market that creates such a small patient pool, it can be hard for companies to thrive. And so Twyla's asking, how do I apply for a medical license? You don't right now. Right now, we are waiting for the session to start so that we can improve the program. And by improving the program, open it up broadly enough so that there's a large enough patient pool that DPS will start to open up application process again. And then I also wanted to reflect what Erin is talking about she joined her local chamber of commerce as a hemp farmer, right? And I think what hemp did last session and over this interim has really helped destigmatize cannabis in rural areas. I work with another nonprofit called Foundation for an Informed Texas, and we really focus on rural education. And so that, on top of hemp rolling out, on top of, now these hemp farmers are their best advocates in these local areas. They know all the people there. It's really destigmatizing the plant overall. And so I think that showing up as business participants in that market, whether it's the hemp market or wanting to participate in a medical or a retail market, I think is extremely important. I think, did we get all the questions?
And look, we're only 3 minutes over on time. I think that's great. Well, this has been great. I guess if there's no final questions, Jax mentioned she's going to send an email follow-up to everyone covering everything we talked about, including lots of links to resources, because there's a ton of information out there, and we want to make sure we get you right to where you need to be. Any final comments, Jax?
No, I'm looking forward to working with you, Heather, this session, and all of our friends on the call today, and new friends and old alike. It's going to take all of us working really hard this session and staying flexible and being in good contact. So we're going to make sure that you're subscribed to our newsletters so that you don't miss a single thing, a single action. And I just want to thank you guys for spending some time on Saturday with us. I know that it's not always easy to get the time, but we definitely appreciate it.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. And as Jack said, looking forward to working with everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
All right. Bye, guys.